February 3rd, 1945, Eifel Hills, Western Germany. The cellar door groaned open, and 12 German women stared up at the silhouettes of American soldiers framed against a sky turning white with snow. Their breath hung in the frozen air between them. For weeks they had been told what would happen if the enemy found them. Now the moment had arrived, and all they could hear was the wind rising and the distant rumble of trucks preparing to leave. They were certain the Americans would drive away and let the blizzard finish what the war had started. If you've ever wondered what happens when humanity cuts through the machinery of war, stay with this story until the very end. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Your support breathes life into these forgotten moments of history, because what unfolded on that frozen road would prove that even in the coldest winter of the century, mercy could still break through. And in that instant when American soldiers decided not to leave, when they chose to carry enemy prisoners through a storm that would claim hundreds of lives across Europe, the word enemy lost all its meaning. The women realized they had been lied to about everything. The winter of 1945 was one of the cruelest Europe had known in generations. Snow piled higher than a standing man across the hills of western Germany. The wind howled day and night, turning roads into rivers of ice and open ground into death traps. Even without bullets, men froze where they slept. For the American forces pushing toward the Rhine, every mile forward was a battle not just against the Wehrmacht, but against a cold that turned rifles into clubs and fingers into wood. The Battle of the Bulge had ended only weeks before. Between mid-December and late January, more than 19,000 American soldiers had died in the snow-covered Ardennes. They had stopped Germany's last great offensive, but the cost was written in frozen blood across 100 shattered villages. Now, in early February, the advance resumed. Engineers strung 500 yards of communication wire for every mile gained. They cleared rubble, laid roads, and turned ghost towns into supply hubs. Behind them, the German front collapsed in slow motion. Trains no longer ran on schedule. Orders arrived late or not at all. Among the thousands of stragglers retreating through the icy hills were women from Wehrmacht auxiliary units, signals helpers, clerks, medical assistants. Many were barely in their 20s. They had joined thinking they would answer telephones in safe cities far from the front. Instead, the war had chased them east, then west, then into the snow. One group of 12 women marched through the slush near a small village the Americans called Hildorf. They carried canvas packs and shared one small medical bag between them. Their boots were thin, their gray uniforms soaked at the hems. Snow clung to their wool skirts and loose hair. They had been told many things about the enemy. In training sessions and through crackling radio speeches, Nazi instructors warned that American soldiers would humiliate captured German women, starve them, abandon them. Surrender, they were told, was not just cowardly. It was a death sentence. Yet the war around them no longer matched those stories. German officers drove past in trucks while the women walked. In the last month alone, more than 100,000 German soldiers had surrendered in the West without being shot. That was not what the propaganda had promised. One of the women, a signals assistant named Paula, kept a small notebook in her coat pocket. Years later, her son would read her words to a historian. "We were more afraid of the cold than of the enemy by then," she had written. "The snow did not care if you were German or American. It took the weak all the same. The cold was everywhere. Breath came out in white clouds. The insides of gloves stayed damp. When they found a half-burned shed, they broke off blackened boards and tried to start a fire. The wood hissed and spat smoke that stung their eyes. For a few minutes they felt heat on their faces. Then the wind took that, too. The paradox was simple and cruel. They wore the uniform of a regime that spoke endlessly of strength and final victory. Yet they were hungry, freezing, and alone. The Third Reich still filled the airwaves with talk of secret weapons and inevitable triumph. On the ground, 12 women shuffled along a ruined lane, sharing a crust of bread that had to last 2 days. Overhead, American planes moved east in formations so dense they looked like migrating birds. In January 1945, Allied bombers had dropped over 40,000 tons of explosives on Germany in a single month. The women heard the distant thunder, but could not see the aircraft through the low clouds. They only saw the results: smashed bridges, smoking rail yards, villages with more walls missing than standing. At night, the sounds changed. No more engines in the sky, only the distant thump of artillery and the closer creak of frozen trees bending under the weight of ice. Sometimes a branch snapped and fell. In the dark it sounded like rifle fire, and the women flinched. One night, crammed into the cellar of a half-ruined schoolhouse, they listened to the wind and to each other's shallow breathing. The air smelled of damp plaster, burned wood, and unwashed bodies. They had one small stove and a little coal. They argued quietly about whether to keep the fire going or save fuel for the next day. In the end, they let it burn low. Sleep, when it came, was thin and full of bad dreams. "We were told we must never fall into enemy hands," Paula wrote. "But there in that cellar, I began to think perhaps the enemy could not be worse than this." Beyond the village, American patrols were closing in, moving from farm to farm, house to house, counting prisoners and checking cellars for hidden weapons. They had weather reports in their pockets. Temperatures dropping, snow coming, a blizzard likely within 24 hours. The roads would soon be deadly. The paths of the shivering German women and the tired American soldiers were about to cross just as the worst storm of the month rolled over the Eifel hills. And what happened next would prove that some decisions cannot be found in any manual. At first light, the Americans came into Hildorf. Their boots rang on broken cobblestones. Tanks and trucks growled between half-ruined houses. The air smelled of diesel, smoke, and whetstone. A rifle platoon from an infantry regiment moved ahead of the vehicles, checking doors and cellars. In this sector, the U.S. First Army had taken more than 10,000 prisoners in the last 2 weeks. Most surrendered without a fight. A few still hid and shot from windows. Sergeant Tom Miller led one squad toward the old schoolhouse. Glass crunched under his boots. A blackboard leaned against a cracked wall. Somewhere below, he heard a faint cough. He signaled for quiet. The men stopped. Only the ticking of a distant engine and the soft hiss of falling snow broke the silence. Miller eased the cellar door open. A wave of cold, damp air hit his face, carrying the smell of coal smoke and unwashed bodies. Flashlights cut through the dark. 12 pale faces turned toward the light. Women, thin and gray with exhaustion, blinked and tried to stand. Some raised their hands at once. One clutched a Red Cross armband to her chest like a shield. For a second, both sides simply stared. The Americans had expected maybe a sniper or a rear guard. The women had expected men with hard faces and harder hands. Instead, there was a moment of shared surprise. One of the women tried to speak. "We're Sin Senator," she said. "Medics." Her voice cracked. Another stood and pointed to her gray sleeve, where faded insignia marked her as a signals helper. Paula later wrote, "I thought this is the end. Now they will do all the things we were warned about." Miller did not understand German, but he saw no weapons, only fear and thin coats. "They're auxiliaries," said Corporal Diaz, the medic, pointing to the armband. "They're half frozen." His breath steamed in the beam of his flashlight. Outside, the wind picked up, pushing snow through broken windows and fine white curtains. In the command post 2 streets away, the company radio crackled with new orders. A staff officer's voice came through flat and urgent. "Pull back to the ridge line by nightfall." A blizzard was coming. No delays, no stray patrols. The weather report from division said it clearly. Temperatures would drop below -15°C. Wind gusts could reach 60 kilometers per hour. In such conditions, exposed skin froze in minutes. Trucks stalled, guns iced over. In January alone, more than 500 American soldiers in Europe had been recorded as cold weather casualties. Now Miller's men were told to move fast. The road east would soon be blocked by snow and wrecks. Their trucks already sat full of men and supplies. There was no spare space, at least not on paper. Down in the cellar, the women watched as the Americans spoke into their radios. They caught only a few words. "Prisoners, 12 female, storm." But the tone was clear. Time was short. One private muttered, "We can march them to the crossroads and leave them with the next outfit." Another said nothing, but stared at the women's feet. 3 of them had boots so worn that bare toes peeked through holes, purple from cold. Paula wrote, "I waited for them to decide which of us could walk and which would be left. We were enemy soldiers, after all, even if we did not feel like soldiers." Here was the sharp contrast. On the map, these 12 women were just numbers, meant to be moved from one report column to another. In the cellar, they shivered, coughed, and wiped smoke from their eyes. The war machine saw statistics. The men saw human beings. Lieutenant Harris, the platoon leader, came down the stairs, ducking under a broken beam. Snowflakes swirled in behind him. He felt the cold like a hand on the back of his neck. "We've got to clear this town and fall back," he told Miller. "Trucks are packed. Roads are turning to ice." Miller looked from his officer to the women. "Sir, some of them can't walk a mile, let alone 5, he said quietly. Diaz nodded. "They won't last an hour out there," the medic added. Later, Harris would tell an Army historian the book answer was simple. Move on. Let the rear guard deal with them. But when you see their faces, it stops being simple. They brought the women out of the cellar one by one. The gray sky pressed low over the village. Snow pricked cheeks and lashes. Engines idled, sending up clouds of exhaust that smelled oily and bitter but promised movement and warmth. A few women could walk, limping, using each other's arms for balance. Others could barely stand. One collapsed as soon as she reached the street, her legs folding under her. Diaz checked her pulse with gloved fingers, feeling the slow, weak beat. Above them, white clouds gathered thicker by the minute. The first true gusts of the coming storm shoved at men and women alike, making them stagger. Somewhere behind the lines, officers counted miles and hours. Here, at the edge of Hildorf, a small group of soldiers had to decide what those numbers meant for the lives in front of them. And the blizzard was already closing in. Snow thickened over Hildreth as men and women waited at the edge of the village. Engines idled, metal ticking as it cooled. The air was sharp with exhaust, cold iron, and the faint smell of burned wood drifting from ruined houses. Lieutenant Harris stood by the lead truck, radio handset pressed to his ear. A voice from battalion repeated the same message. Pull back to the ridge before dark. No delays, the line had to move. Artillery and fuel were already calculated for the next position. Mile by mile, each 2.5-ton truck was packed. Regulations said a truck could carry about 25 fully equipped soldiers. Today, most carried closer to 30, plus crates of ammunition and fuel cans. There was no line in the manual for add a dozen half-frozen enemy women. Sergeant Miller and Diaz walked slowly down the row of prisoners. Snow squeaked under their boots. They checked hands and faces for white, numb patches of frostbite. Out of 12 German women, they judged 4 completely unable to walk far. 3 more could stand only with help. Diaz pulled off one glove and touched a bare foot where the boot's sole had split. The skin felt like cold wax. "She won't make a kilometer," he said quietly. "Not in this." A private nearby shifted his rifle. "We can't carry them all," he muttered. "We can't even fit them in the trucks." "Orders say move, Sarge." That was the heart of the problem. On paper, war was neat arrows on maps, blocks of numbers, plans written in clean ink. In reality, it looked like this. Shivering women with blue lips and tired men trying to match orders to conscience, while icy wind tried to push everyone off the road. Later, Harris would tell an Army historian the legal answer was simple. Leave them in a house, report their location. Let the rear units pick them up if they could. But when I looked at them, I knew rear units wouldn't get through that storm in time. Paula noticed the men's faces as they spoke. "They argued among themselves," she wrote. One pointed to our feet and shook his head. Another looked at the sky. I did not understand the words, but I understood that our lives were being weighed. The paradox cut deep. These women had worn the uniform of a state that boasted of hardness and sacrifice. Now, in the snow, it was the enemy who had to decide how much their lives were worth. Harris called his sergeants close. Snowflakes clung to his eyebrows. His breath came in short white bursts. "Battalion wants us on that ridge before night," he said. "Trucks can take the walking ones. That's maybe 5. That leaves 7 who can't handle the march." Miller stared back. "Sir, if we leave them and that storm hits like they say, they're done," he answered. "We've already taken more than 200 prisoners this week. I'm not about to start choosing who freezes." For a moment, no one spoke. Wind hissed through the bare branches over the road. From inside one truck, a radio played a faint swing tune, thin and strange in the winter air. "We could stay with them," Diaz suggested. "Small group? March on foot. Carry the worst cases. Catch up tomorrow." Harris did the quick math in his head. Holding back a squad meant fewer rifles at the next line. It meant men he knew by name. Miller, Diaz, Jenkins, O'Reilly would be out in the open when the storm came. It was risk, plain and simple. But there was another kind of risk, one no report would show. If they walked away now, they would remember these faces for the rest of their lives. "I didn't want to tell my grandchildren I left girls in a ditch because the weather was bad," he said later. "War's ugly, but it doesn't excuse everything." Harris finally spoke. We're not abandoning them. Trucks take those who can walk. Miller, you take a squad and the weakest prisoners. If they can't walk, you carry them. A private protested, Sir, that's 6-7 miles. It'll be ice by dark. Then move faster, Harris said. Softer. No one gets left to die in a ditch. That's an order. Paula remembered an American miming, lifting her onto his shoulders. Only then did I understand. They would not leave us. Men loosened their packs, glanced at the women they would carry, and the trucks rolled off into the first sheets of snow. Miller's squad and 7 frail prisoners stepped into open fields, nothing between Hildorf and the ridge but wind and white distance. The storm swallowed them. One moment they saw truck lights, the next nothing. They tied ropes around their waists and leaned into -15 cold and 60-kilometer gusts. 8 Americans and 7 women fought for each step. 2 women collapsed. Miller carried one. 19-year-old Jenkins carried the other. Paula walked between 2 soldiers, gripping their arms as the world shrank to breath and snow. Jenkins stumbled into a ditch, numb. If it hurts, it's alive, Diaz told him, hauling him up. They marched in 50-step bursts. When a woman fell, packs dropped and someone carried her. Miller's shoulders burned. The woman on his back weighed little, but every ounce was stone. A faint orange glow finally appeared. A farmhouse, a Red Cross tent. Medics wrapped frozen feet, offered soup, and covered Germans and Americans with the same blankets. Years later, Paula wrote, "Mercy moved through war, not with speeches, but with a soldier carrying an enemy through the snow. For 2 days the storm killed dozens across the hills. But in that farmhouse, 12 German women and 8 American soldiers sat together, alive because someone refused to walk away."